Hello YouTube. This evening I would like to talk about solar panels, specifically the differences between monocrystalline solar panels and polycrystalline solar panels. I get a lot of questions from a lot of people about this, in my view, needless agony about what to go for, monos or polys, and there's so much misinformation out there. There's so many myths out there, which I shall try to do my best in my limited knowledge. I don't pretend to be the world expert in solar panel, technology, but in my limited experience and as far as I know, I'd like to share my feelings about the differences between these kinds of panels. Monocrystalline panels essentially means that this panel, made from silicon, but made from a single silicon crystal, a single ingot of silicon, and that ingot, which is a long cylindrical ingot of silicon, is all the same crystal. The process of making it means that it forms as a single uniform crystal, with all the crystals nicely aligned, headed in the same direction, and very compact. That is monocrystalline, and as a result of that, the level of purity of silicon is much higher in monocrystallines, because it's the same crystal. It's much more higher levels of purity. And it also means that the color is more uniform, which is why it is this black or very deepish, bluish, blackish color. It comes out in a sort of round cylindrical shape, almost like a very long, thin gas cylinder. That's the shape that it comes out as. And they then get it and cut it into very thin wafers, very round discs, and as opposed to the polycrystalline solar panels, which is like cast in concrete. A very clever person discovered a very clever way of making silicon that was cheaper and wasted less silicon material. So what you do in this case is that you get lots of crystals of silicon, of different crystals, so already it is polycrystalline. It's not the same crystal. You get them and you put them in a mold and you heat the whole thing up, and it forms into this nice little square brick of silicon, which you can then cut into nice slices. So the round monocrystalline ingot gets sliced into wafers, and it comes out as round discs, which you then trim edges off to try as much as possible to get a squarish kind of shape, and it comes out looking something like that. You can tell that it used to be round like that, and then somebody has cut there, cut there, cut there, and cut there off the bottom, but it's still leaving these curved edges, which when you then join them together, they form this little diamond gaps in the panel. So that's your monocrystalline, and this is typically blackish in color. The polycrystalline, this one here, comes out like that, square, bang, and you can just join them straight, there's less wastage. So that is your poly. And essentially, those are the differences in terms of manufacturing. I think I'll do another video to actually go deeper into the manufacturing processes of these two types of silicon. Oh, that's lovely. It's very cold in the UK, so I'm in the UK at the moment. It's really cold. It's snowing outside, and this is 12th of February. Anyway, those are the main differences in terms of the architecture. You can see that it is black. It's got those little white diamonds in between, The white diamonds are actually the white cardboard background, and those are gaps between the edges of the round ends of the silicon discs. And that's the monocrystalline. It is efficient because it is the same silicon crystal. They're packed together, well aligned, high levels of purity, which is why it is more efficient than the polycrystalline panels that are made from lots of different crystals and lots of joints compressed together, almost like a concrete mold, as you would a concrete mold, sorry. And that's your polycrystalline. There's less wastage, it's a cheaper process, and it's slightly less efficient than your monocrystalline. So those are the basic differences. Now, when we are talking about efficiency, solar power generally is an inefficient thing. It's not like nuclear power where every single every single atomic molecule generates massive amounts of power. Solar power, essentially, efficiency levels are sub 20%. They're below 20%. So typically your monocrystalline panels are usually rated at about 17% efficiency. It can range between 15 and 19 efficiency, so that all the energy that's coming, what you get is about 17% of it. Your polycrystallines are rated typically around 15.5% efficiency. Those are the differences. So even when we're talking efficiencies, we're talking, what's the difference between 17% and 16%? To illustrate, I hope that's clear. So that's your mono, and this is your poly. And in terms of efficiency, you can see that where the monos typically post efficiencies of between 15 and 19, typically about 17% efficiency. You have your polys posting efficiencies, typically about 16%, some 15.5, 16%, thereabouts. Usually there's about a 1% difference in efficiencies between the polys and the monos. But the second thing to note is that clearly there are some polycrystalline panels that have better efficiencies than some monocrystalline panels, especially cheap quality monocrystalline, cheaply made grade D panels would have horrible efficiencies compared to a top quality grade A polycrystalline panel. So as you can see, therefore, yes, theoretically, nominally, monocrystalline panels post higher efficiencies than polys, but then that is not the end of the story. And what do we mean by efficiencies? Because this increased efficiency that you get with monos, you've got to question yourself whether it's actually any use or any help to you, a residential domestic solar homeowner. And I illustrate on this here. Again, you've got your monos on that side and you've got your polys on this side. Say we are getting from the source, either the sun or in the lab, etc., 1,562 watts. A module a solar panel that was 16% efficient would typically be generating about 250 watts for us. Yeah, so your polys typically will be generating about 250 watts for us. Whereas under the same conditions, your monos will be pushing out to 265 watts for us. But again, that difference doesn't necessarily come into play or is appreciable enough to make an impact when it comes to small solar installations for homeowners, etc. If you were thinking of a massive solar array, like a solar farm or a massive array for like a huge project or something, then you might start thinking, oh my God, if I go for this more expensive monocrystalline panels, in the long run, it might be cheaper for me because I'll be using fewer panels to get for the same array size. Fewer panels means less railing, less cables, less labor, so in the long run it might work out cheaper in that sense. But if I was thinking about just putting up 6 solar panels, 6, or say 12, actually I use 12 because typically we install 3,000 watt, 3 kilowatt arrays for residential, large residences, etc. So if we install in 3,000 watts for you, this is about 12 solar panels. For you to get 3,000 watts with this, we would have to install only, not 12, but only 11.3 panels. Well, what is the meaning of 11.3 panels? It doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a 0.3 of a panel. The differences are so little that you're still going to end up installing your 12 panels here as compared to there. You might get slightly more power over the course of, but again, as long as you're getting enough power as a homeowner, it shouldn't make any appreciable difference. But those are the differences. There are definite efficiency differences between monos and polys. Now, if you were to have, you see this is a 250 watt poly, if you were to have a 250 watt mono, equivalent 250, it would be a slightly smaller panel than the equivalent poly, because it's all about efficiency, is all about surface area. So you can see that the monocrystalline panels are generally more compact than the polys because they're more efficient. They need less surface area to generate the same power. Although the difference, again, as I say, is just 1%. So there you have the efficiency arguments. You could also then argue that, well, I know it's just 1%, but 1% adds up over the course of 1 year, 6 years, 15 years, 20 years, etc. Definitely, absolutely, and that is one of the considerations. But then if you're not selling power and you're not a solar plant and you're getting enough power from the sun to power your home, could say, well, why spend the extra amount of money? Why not just go for something that will meet your needs at less cost? So you can see the arguments are back and forth depending on the kind of installation you're doing and the purposes you want to use the solar panels for. But for most residential customers, I will say to you, it does not make a difference. You would be better advised to spend your energy making sure you have good quality panels, because they are cheap grade D quality monos as well as cheap grade D quality polycrystalline panels. Okay, so I'll spend more of my energies there. The sun is free, so we're not paying for fuel. The fuel is free. So whether you're getting an extra 1% out of your, and I'm not, if I'm meeting my needs and you're meeting your needs, what are we talking about? But if it's a larger installation and we have things to do and it's a farm, etc., or, and this is where I consider there's a major difference, even for smaller customers. If space is an issue, some people have a very limited space. So for me to put my 12 panels monos, it takes less space than 12 panels poly. So those are the considerations that you need to, those are the facts. So in the final analysis, you find for residential customers is more of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Okay. The other difference that is often talked about is the issue of temperature derating, temperature effects on solar panels, either monocrystalline or polycrystalline solar panels. And if you look at the sort of data information on the solar panels, they always give you a figure, temperature derating coefficient for that panel. And again, there are differences there between monos and polys. Monocrystalline panels tend to have better figures when it comes to handling increasing temperatures, as in they perform slightly better under increasing temperatures. than polycrystalline panels. Again, the differences I'll need to illustrate. Here we have a polycrystalline panel. Temperature coefficient is 0.48. Typical, these are typical values for 250 watt panels. This temperature and that 250 watt are all measured at 20 degrees centigrade under standard conditions. So what it means is that for every increase in temperature, every 1 degree increase in temperature, we will lose 1.2 watts per degree centigrade increase. Whereas for the mono it's 0.46, which means that we will be losing 1.15 watts. Can you see the difference? Very tiny. Which means that where my 250 watts at 35 degrees, which is 15 degrees higher than 20, would derate by 18 watts. If it was a poly, if it was a mono, it would only be derating by 17.3 watts. I hope that's clear. So that my 250 watt ultimately becomes a 232 watt panel poly, but if it was a mono, it becomes a 232.7 watts. Those are the differences we're talking about. Very, very marginal differences. Obviously, we that live in sort of warmer climates, temperatures are typically 33, 34, 35 and above sometimes. We do experience that derating, but again, the difference between the derating you see in a poly as compared to a mono, monos are they perform slightly better, but is that enough to justify the additional cost? And that is where you have to weigh the pros and cons yourself. For me personally, I think these are tiny differences, because sometimes these mathematical differences are there, but in practical terms, especially when you live in a very, very sunny environment, and your panels are put on top of your roof where there's no shading, I don't see how these make any difference. And this is what I try to say to people. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, ultimately. You'll be better off spending your time ensuring that you get a good installer who will make sure and who knows that there has to be a gap between your roof space and your solar panel to allow for cooling. So if you get a monocrystalline panel and you plaster it on your roof, as they often do, and I've seen them, you're wasting your time. A well-installed polycrystalline will outperform you by a factor of 20. So for me, these are not things to worry about when you live in tropical sunny West Africa. These differences are just, they're there, but they are, However, if you were looking at putting up 1,000 solar panels, these little differences begin to, 10,000 solar panel farm, they begin to add up. So there you have it. So just like with the efficiency, you can see that with the temperature coefficient differences between the monos and polys, it's there theoretically, but it's pretty much an academic exercise. The other thing they talk about is performance under imperfect light. So we're not talking your panels being shaded, because if your panel is shaded, it's not going to produce anything, regardless of mono or poly. No, here we're talking about on a dull day, on a cloudy day, etc., on a hazy day. Generally, they talk about monocrystallines performing slightly better under those conditions than your polycrystallines. But my experience has been this. That difference, if it truly exists, that difference is also likely minor. And I know for a fact that in the environment that I operate in Southwest Nigeria, West Africa, the insolation is powerful, the sun is powerful, We have a lot more sun than our brothers and sisters in more temperate conditions, like Germany, or they don't get as much sun as we do. So I can understand that they would, look into those things a lot more. In Nigeria, the sun is hot, it's sizzling, and that's the case for a lot of West Africa. So, in essence, you've got your monocrystalline panels and you've got your polycrystalline panels. For me, I think it becomes a consideration for me if your roof space becomes an issue. So that I know that the monocrystallines are slightly more compact and it can be more efficient for me to use monocrystalline panels. Otherwise, it doesn't really factor into many of my considerations as a solar installer, because the differences in efficiency, the differences in temperature derating are there, but ultimately they are not substantive enough or substantial enough to make any significant practical sense when it comes to choosing between the two for your solar installation. Cost is an issue. Sometimes we find monocrystallines just as cheap as polycrystallines, in which case, well, okay, go for the monos. But more often than not, you find that you're paying more for the monocrystallines than the polycrystallines, and you need to ask yourself, is the additional expense worth it in the end? When I've done large installations for clients, it's been more of a consideration, because then those little differences start to build up. Don't get me wrong, I use monos more often than I use polys. For me, it's usually down to a case of what panels do I have available on ground now. Of more impact to you as a user should be the quality of the panels, either mono or polys, because you get very shoddy, cheap quality monocrystallines, very shoddy, cheap quality polycrystallines. That is where I would spend my energies looking to make sure and ensure that I'm not putting up and investing, cheap panels that will not last or stand the test of time. Good grade A quality panels should outlast you. They should certainly be performing above 80% of the rated value in 40, 45, 50 years. Good quality panels. So I hope that explains some of the differences between your monos and your polys, and certainly the thinking when we choose these two different kinds of panels. Essentially, it shouldn't make a difference if you are planning your installation right. You should be more worried about the quality of panels, having a balanced system throughout, and having proper calculations in terms of your energy consumption and energy generation, etc. Just balance. So I hope that's been helpful. YouTube, thanks for listening. Yes, YouTube out.